At its core, storytelling is an invitation for a connection, a way to give form to memory, to share our collective wisdom, to ensure that the lessons of the past continue to inform our future. Storytelling helps us to bridge divides. It challenges us to feel for those who we've never met, to lift voices that are too often left unheard and pushed to society's margin. But perhaps most of all, what storytelling is it gives us power. It gives us the ability to understand what it means to be human. Here at Gettysburg, we have a special responsibility as storytellers. This is a place where stories of courage and conscience are written deeply into the land here. By living here, by learning here, by growing here, our Gettysburg College students are reminded every day of Lincoln's call to be dedicated to the unfinished work of their time, and they meet that call with determination and purpose. But few people have met this call more powerfully than has Ken Burns through his life's work. His iconic films have helped us see more clearly where we've been as a country and where, with fortitude, we can choose to go. In so many ways, his stories haven't just shaped our understanding of history, they've deepened our understanding of ourselves and one another. I am so pleased to welcome Ken back to Gettysburg. Together with Jake, they will offer us a unique window into how the best stories stand the test of time. And now, it is my great honor to present the craft of storytelling. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome. I am happy to be back in the Majestic Theater. I am happy to be back in Gettysburg, happy to be back in the orbit of Gettysburg College, one of my favorite institutions of higher education on this planet. Bob, thank you for the generous introduction. I have had the great privilege, as I think I've explained to you before, of making films about the U.S., but I've also had the privilege of making films about us. That is to say, all of the intimacy of us, that two-letter lowercase plural pronoun, and we, and our, as well as the majesty, the complexity, the contradictions, and even the controversy of the United States. It's a privileged space that I've had the great opportunity for nearly 5 decades of occupying, and I'm grateful to you, the listeners and the watchers of our storytelling, to do that. So this afternoon, briefly, we're going to have a conversation about a little bit of the mechanics of it. A couple of things I just want to say before we look at about 15 minutes of clips, and then very much looking forward to a conversation with Jake about the subject at hand. The novelist Richard Powers, contemporary novelist many of you might know, said, "The best arguments in the world," to which I would say, and that's all we do today is argue. "The best arguments in the world," he said, "won't change a single person's point of view. The only thing that can do that is a good story." You know, we live in a media culture and we live in a computer world in which everything is a 1 or a 0, a yes or a no, a good or bad, a red state or blue state, a young or old, a black or white, a gay or straight. And we think that everything hinges on this binary hinge. And there's nothing binary in nature. You can't be friends. You can't raise children, you can't be married if you think it's a 1 and a 0, right? And what storytelling permits us to do is have nuanced conversations, to understand that there are ways of balancing strengths and weaknesses, ways of forgiving, ways of being certain, ways of being uncertain, that are all part of the craft of storytelling, which is essentially how we distill and communicate human experience. Honey, "How was your day?" does not begin, "I back slowly down the driveway, avoiding the garbage can at the curb." Unless, of course, you're T-boned, at which case that's exactly the way you tell the story. We edit our human experience with an idea of giving what we have distilled to someone else. And in that act of gift and in that act of reception is where stories take place. My life, my childhood is all tragedy. My mother got cancer when I was 2 years old. She died when I was 11, a couple months short of my 12th birthday. There was never a moment growing up where I did not have this sort of Damocles. A couple of weeks ago was the 60th anniversary of her death, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that 60 years is too long to be without a mother. Soon after that, my father, who did not cry when she was sick, did not cry when she died, and did not cry at this incredibly sad funeral, would have a very tough curfew for my younger brother and me, but he'd forgive it if there was a movie on TV or a new new wave film that was playing at the cinema, or a film festival like this one that was taking place. This was in Ann Arbor, Michigan, at the architecture school, or at the Ann Arbor Film Festival, or whatever it might be. And one evening at home, staying up late on a school night till like 1 a.m., I was like, who got to do that? We were watching an old film about the Irish Troubles from the 19-teens and 20s called Odd Men Out by Sir Carol Reed. And it stars James Mason. And my father started to cry. And I had never seen him cry. And at that moment, I realized that in his very complicated and too short life, that somehow this movie had provided him with an emotional safe haven. And at that moment, I was now 12, I vowed to become a filmmaker. I didn't really know why. It took me a really, really long time to understand. And at that point, that meant I was going to be Howard Hawks or Alfred Hitchcock or John Ford and do Hollywood films. And I very fortunately ended up going to Hampshire College in Amherst, Massachusetts, which was a brand new experimental school. Wow, yeah. We need $10 million to be financially, fiscally safe, so I'll see you afterwards. And they reminded me that there is much truth in what is and what was, human experience, and anything the human imagination can dream of. And I suddenly, by 18, 12 filmmaker, 18 documentary film, by the time I graduated, the last shot of the film I did as my final project was a pan across a painting. And I thought, if you told me that I would be still making films 55 years later about history, I would be super surprised, but that is exactly what I've done. A few years into my professional life, my late father-in-law, who was an eminent psychologist, I had mentioned to him that I seemed to be keeping my mother alive. I would be aware of the date of her death approaching and then receding, April 28th, 1965, but I never was present on the day. And then he said this amazing thing. He said, "I bet you blew your candles out on your cake growing up, wishing she'd come back." I go, "How'd you know?" Every time, you blow out your candle, you want whatever it is you want. I always wanted her to come. And then he named 3 or 4 other things, intimate things that only I knew, secrets that I'd had. And then I said, "How did you know?" And he said, "Look what you do for a living." And I said, "Excuse me?" He said, "You wake the dead. You make Abraham Lincoln and Jackie Robinson come alive. Who do you think you're really trying to wake up?" I was 39, almost 40, well into my professional life. And all of a sudden, here was an interior, can't call it dime store psychological because he was an eminent psychologist, interpretation of everything I'd done. And from that moment on, it really changed the dynamics of my work. And I don't think it changed how the product was made, but it changed my own understanding and relationship and the intimacy with which all of us are engaged, whether we know it or not, whether it's a complaint, whether it's an exaltation in this business of storytelling. So I've talked way more than I'd planned to. We're going to show clips from a handful of things. The most important thing is that when I was at Hampshire College, we looked at lots of films, experimental films, new wave films, expressionist films, people drawing on things, people painting on films, traditional Hollywood films. And there was a documentary by a woman named Perry Miller Adato on Gertrude Stein called When This You See, Remember Me. And it had a traditional third-person narrator, which we're familiar with in documentaries. But it also had actors on a stage reading things that she had written or that other people had written about her. And I remember watching it and going, oh, that's an interesting way to make the past come alive. And at one point, one of the voices was still talking when they cut away, when she cut away to a street scene of Paris in the 1920s. And the voice continued for just 2 or 3 seconds. And I went, why did we need to see the actors? Why couldn't we just hear the voices? And so a lot of the films that I've made are based on, I'm not here. A lot of the films that I've made are based not just on the third-person exposition of the story, and then, but a first-person explanation of it. And those chorus of voices often complement the third-person narration, and I think enrich and give dimension to the stories. We begin to understand. I've just finished a film on the American Revolution in which we're really celebrating hundreds of voices, both familiar, like George Washington, but also unfamiliar, a 14-year-old fifer named John Greenwood, who signs up just after Lexington and Concord and fights throughout the war. Voices like that. And then when you get into relatively contemporary things like our film on World War II or particularly Vietnam, you have the ability to talk to people who are still alive or were once alive that experience this, and they are the sort of modern equivalents of those first-person voices, those chorus of voices. So in that combination is where I have spent a good deal of my professional life, or attempt at understanding the dynamics of storytelling to express this. So 15 minutes of clips all over the places. You're going to parachute into places. You'll find your bearing in a couple seconds, and then maybe Jake and I can offer some real sense of something when we get together in conversation. So let's roll the clip reel. I'll see you in 15 minutes. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thanks for being here. Ken Burns, in case you didn't know. I see you've met them before.
The hands are hurting already. Yeah, that's fine.
Well, this session is obviously about storytelling, and you just saw some of the excerpts of how Ken and his team at Florentine tell stories. And so you really see kind of the whole range of his filmmaking career to some extent there. And the very first scene is short. It's really it's the Brooklyn Bridge. It's the very first scene of your very first film for public television. And that comes out just like that, first time at bat.
So a lot of things went into that. It's so interesting. That image of the Brooklyn Bridge in which the towers are compressed, I spent a couple of years trying to figure out what window of what building you could take a shot that would collapse the two towers together so that they're side by side in a telephoto lens. And I figured out after about a year that it was the municipal building, which is where a lot of the New York City of New York offices were. And after much experimentation, sort of pre-crazy security times, going up and down elevators and going into various offices, I determined it was on the 17th floor of the finance department. Then I had to find out a time when there would be really good light. So there would be a kind of beautiful image on it. And I remember going up there, nobody stopped us, and walking down this corridor and finally walking down room after room, looking, and finally coming to a woman, a clerical assistant's office, and saying to her, is it okay if we spend 30 seconds filming out your window? And she said, okay. And we got that shot, which is just a spectacular shot. And what we do in our film is we collect a lot of inventory. We're not saying, oh, this shot will be the first shot of the film, or the first shot of the film should be something like this. Just as we've just finished a film and we thought, and we're sorry that we're going to tease it to you, the film we've just completed on the history of the American Revolution. There are no photographs, there's no newsreel, and so we had to go out, and for several years we filmed all up and down the East Coast, all these reenactment groups. They might be German reenactment groups, French, British Army, of course, militia, Continental Army, black soldiers, Native American soldiers, everybody, women who would attach themselves to armies on both sides, children that were attaching themselves, camp life, all of that sort of stuff. And it wasn't ever, we never directed them to do something because we knew it was going to go in this scene in the Battle of Germantown, or we knew that this musket volley was going, we just collected it so that almost after we were done, it was like going to the National Archives and finding the archives from World War II that we're going to use to illustrate the story of Daniel Inouye's unbelievable bravery that day in northern Italy in the spring of 45. So, you know, we would then use the stuff and try to intermix them with not photographs, but paintings and maps and drawings and journals and written things that we could do. And so all of the films have to be seen as not, I was saying this at lunch to somebody, not as additive, but as subtractive. You're always pulling things away. What's on the cutting room floor is not bad, but always wonderful things. And so you're getting down. So at some point, I sort of knew I would start with that quote, which I just love from the Harper's Weekly in the month that the Brooklyn Bridge was opened. But what were you going to show? And then finally that shot, which had taken so long to sort of calculate and to get and looked so amazing, sort of became the way to just to do it, to just have it. And there's not every single one of these stories, every single one of these shots has a story behind it,
sure,
too.
Yeah. Well, and it's, at what point into the making of the film, I know Brooklyn Bridge took you 5 years or to make, and at what point did you know that was the beginning of the film? That, like, when did you actually edit that? Was that at the beginning of the editing or late into it? Or
I think it was pretty early. That's not always the case. In fact, what I thought I was going to show you from the American Revolution that just, I guess, was lopped off that reel, it actually had been for about a year or something else. And we just, as often is the case, we would move things around. And we took something later in the introduction and moved it to the opening, a quote by Thomas Paine of a time-lapse tilt of a dawn and a cannon in the foreground. And it was very effective, and it needed some revitalization. Sometimes you get used to things, and after a while, something settles in and you've sort of bought into your own stultification. And it's really sometimes helpful to sort of blow these things up, to rethink. And so we've performed in almost every film something, the Civil War series, to give you one example, for 99% of the editing, began with a quote from Walt Whitman, which says, "Future years will never know the black infernal background, the countless minor scenes and interiors of the Secession War, and it's best they should not. The real war will never get in the books." Walt Whitman. Great quote, right?
So the fire, that.
So then I'm going, we'll never get in the books. Are we saying we'll get into documentary films? Is there some kind of arrogance that we're implying here? And of course, everybody's looking at me like I'm crazy. But I then switched it out within the last few days of editing with a quote from Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., who was wounded 6 times during the war and later became a justice of the Supreme Court. "We have shared the incommunicable experience of war. We still feel the passion of life at its top. In our youths, our hearts were touched with fire." And so that's really different, and it's also a perfect beginning. And what I felt was, well, Walt Whitman will go in the last episode. Like, we'll just find a place, because it's very much a valedictory kind of statement, and we were doing it at the beginning, which was a perfect place for a valedictory kind of statement. And I never found a place that was going to shoehorn into an episode that had already sort of congealed, had come together and had a integrity, and I didn't want to feel like it's forced. So that quote by Walt Whitman, which is as good as any quote we've ever had, read by Garrison Keillor as well as anybody could read a quote, is not in the film. It's on my hard drive, and I'll never forget it. And that's what it is. When I mean subtractive, you presume that when you make something, it's additive. But as a sculptress knows, you bring a block of stone to the studio, and you hack away. And what is seen in the gallery of the museum is only part. The negative space of creation has to be acknowledged as well. You always know what's not in there. I'm still in a place, we won't deliver to PBS until the end of June, and so I wake up every morning thinking, could we get this shot in? Is that really the best shot? I changed something. I showed a clip day before yesterday in Washington, D.C. on a scene about Washington, and it ended with a shot that I'd already changed and made it a different shot. It's a beautiful, gorgeous, kind of even more beautiful than the shot where you hear Frederick Douglass's devastating knife in the heart, which is the first voice after the prologue in the introduction that you hear. That's how the Civil War goes off, right? That is with that unutterable loathing quote. But this one is gorgeous, saying that, you know, there's no way the United States could come into existence without George Washington. And it was beautiful, and I said, you know what? You know that shot we have of a Continental Army uniform jacket draped over a chair in a house, at exterior of a house at night with a candle flickering? I said, let's just do that and just zoom in. So you don't see a George Washington, there's nobody there, it's just a jacket on a thing, and somebody's up late at night worrying about you. And it's George Washington, and it works so much better, even though this shot was so gorgeous. And somebody last night, night before last, as I was showing it, said, "Oh, that's so beautiful." I went, it's not in anymore.
The director's cut,
Yeah,
right? Yeah. Well, even back to that Brooklyn Bridge, and you referenced the Periadato film, and the Gertrude says, I just learned about this, a week or two ago when you sent it, and so and I watched it, and so there's a film from the early 70s.
Yeah, it's
a
a wonderful film.
Yeah.
And it really, it helped me, and I've honored her. I knew her, she's passed away recently, and I would talk to her off and on. Her professional life didn't really take off. She made a number of films, but I remember telling her how influential it was to me, because she had felt that there was something theatrical in the reading of these voices, which of course there is, and why she felt the need to put them in the stage was a perfectly legitimate thing. I just realized that they were more, what it did is it introduced a whole nother set of questions, right? You're doing a biography of Gertrude Stein, you've got old photographs, portraits of her, Paris in the 20s, the print on the page, whatever it was that she used. But then you would see these actors, and they'd be on a stage with a black background and a music stand, and they're reading. And then it makes you ask questions. Who are these people? What are they doing? How did she, and that, wasn't that an interruption? So when that one time where she had cut early out of the voice, but the voice is still going to a street scene, I just said, don't ever show them, right? It was like this great gift. Don't ever show them. All the first person voices that we have in our film, you hear off camera, read by Tom Hanks or Meryl Streep or, Josh Brolin or whomever it might be.
So you're seeing this this is
Morgan Freeman.
This is at Hampshire. So you're in college. You're at a liberal arts college.
Yeah.
Seeing this film, and Jerry Liebling's your professor. You're still photography, reading a photograph. This is all going on with you, kind of intellectually at this time.
So I've developed this interest in sort of waking up a still photograph, like treating it like the feature filmmaker that I said I wanted to be, that had a master shot, a long shot, a medium shot, a close shot, a tilt, a pan, a reveal, insert of details. But then there was an oral dimension to waking that up too, where the cannon firing, where the troops tramping, was the bat cracking, all the oral questions you might ask. But there was a fundamental one about exposition and how you handle exposition. Would it be narrated, which was traditional, particularly if you're into historical films, but couldn't you interrupt it by first-person voices that would give you a sense of the style of articulation, the age in which people were. You could begin to feel that people were very much like ourselves. At the same time, there might be something anachronistic or archaic about it. At the same time, you could understand that some of the basic human emotions. There's a moment when George Washington's in Valley Forge. We know all the stories about Valley Forge. They're all true, and they're much worse than you can possibly imagine. It's the 5th largest city, and people are dying by the thousands, right? And the Congress, which is in exile in York, says, why aren't you getting the British out of Philadelphia? His blunder at Brandywine and then the massacre of General Wayne's troops at Paoli have let the British right into Philadelphia, and they're occupying that, and he's trying to figure out what to do, and he's going to go to Germantown and is going to win, but then loses for incredibly insane reasons. But you are always in the mind of who they are and what they're thinking and what they're about. And he's got a funny quote which sounds so much like today, like, I didn't ask for this job. It was given to me, and at that point, when you don't think I can do the job, I will be happy to repair to retirement, and I would feel as happy as any pilgrim upon his arrival in the Holy Land. Like, go ahead, send me back to Mount Vernon.
Cincinnatus before the job's done.
Please send me back to Mount Vernon. And yet he's not going to quit, and he's not going to do it, and he is indispensable, and he does make mistakes, and he is flawed, and he is rash, but he's all those things. And these voices help you understand an essential humanity about him. Even the villains of the piece. In the opening moments of our second episode, we introduce a guy who, along with Ethan Allen, takes over the British garrison at Fort Ticonderoga at the southern end of Lake Champlain with all its cannon, which Washington will need to get the British out of Boston, a year later. And that guy's name is Benedict Arnold. And it isn't until the middle or a third of the way through the 6th and last episode that you find out why that name has why when we showed it at the military academy, the cadets booed for like 3 minutes and missed the whole beginning of the next clip that we were showing them. Up until that point, he is one of the fightingest generals, and he proves it at Quebec. He proves it. He's the hero of Saratoga, which is the key battle which earns French support. It's clearly one of the most important battles. Washington's nowhere to be seen. He's down, in the Mid-Atlantic, but this is up at Saratoga, north of Albany. It's just amazing that it takes that long, and that's what you want to do. That you want history. You want it. Good history means that it might not turn out the way you think it does, the way you know it does.
Well, and that's the storytelling, right?
That's storytelling, that you go to Ford's Theater, and I've had hundreds of people tell me this in our series in the Civil War, that they went there thinking this time the gun might jam.
Yeah. You thought that, right?
And I had an opportunity in the mix of holding off the inevitable killing of him, but it was, just a conceit in a way. But good storytelling means, particularly in history, that even though you know the outcome, like we say in the opening narration about all the different rivers and bodies of water that are involved, and finally the York. So it suggests that something happens at the end near the York River, which is true. But until we get to Yorktown and until they surrender, sorry, I blew it. Spoiler alert. You don't know. And there are lots of times when you think, aha, we're going to win now because the French are on our side. And then the 2 or 3 first French expeditions are abysmal, and they leave and they abandon us. And it's like, oh, well, the French aren't going to work. How are we going to do this, right? Eventually the French work. So it's good storytelling. You always have to discipline yourself. And time is the element in all of these films where you just go over and over and over and over, and you try to hear it anew and hear it as if somebody doesn't know the inevitability. That's the great problem that filmmakers, and a lot of young filmmakers that I advise, their presupposition of what people understand is extending to them way too much. You want somebody that's curious. You want to create that curiosity too, and that's devices of storytelling, but you also don't want them to be anything more than a kind of ignorant person, like an 8th grader, meaning I'm willing to learn anything and I can basically understand most things that you say to me in English. right? And that's what it is. That's where you have to assume, and then you build from there, so that you make them the agents of their own discovery. Even with historical stories, where the inevitability for most people goes without saying, everybody knows what's going to happen.
Well, and that's the art of it, right? I mean, that's literally what you're doing, is you're taking these things that anyone has access to in most cases. I mean, maybe not the footage you're shooting of the interviews, but everyone can get Lincoln's quotes. Anyone can go to the National Archives and get these photographs or pictures in most cases. Yet you're putting them in a certain order, a very, painstaking, multi-year effort to get them in that, to create this. And that's where the crafting of the story comes.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it is just mastering the complexity of telling multiple narratives. I mean, I remember I was at an event in Los Angeles, and I was desperately trying to screw up with the courage to go ask Tom Hanks if he'd be a voice. This is in the early aughts. And I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it. And finally, he broke away from the crowd that he was with and walked over and said, "I owe you big time." And I go, like this. Apparently, in him making this series From the Earth to the Moon, he had studied how in both the Civil War and baseball, we had kept all these narrative balls in the air going at once. And so it's a three-dimensional chess game,
Absolutely.
four-dimensional chess game. And he said, "What can I do? I'd love to repay you, because we found it so invaluable." And I said, "I was just going to ask you to be a voice." So he's been a voice in nearly every film that we've had first-person voices, including The Revolution. And he's incredibly generous, and he is, a huge part, as we'll see this evening, of our World War II film. In spectacular ways that change the dimension of it. But it's to say that these voices have a way of opening things up and acknowledging and helping you keep alive the many balls you have to keep alive structurally in order to tell a complex story. It took 10 and a half years to tell the Vietnam story. It's taken nearly 10 to do the Revolution, because it is so complicated to master a narrative, to know what you can leave out, where you have the courage to leave something out and not make it long and just sort of profligate and flabby, but to how to tell a story. And people come up and say, "Do you have this?" And I go, "Nope." It's not in it. I'm sorry, it's not an encyclopedia, it's a story. And the difference between an encyclopedia and a story is huge.
Yeah.
It's huge. One, you can list things and people are interested in the list and have a certain attention for that list. And the other is, I am obligated to try to arrest your attention at the very beginning and not let it go for, in this case, 2 hours, and then do it 6 more times.
Okay, so Brooklyn Bridge, and it's Academy Award nominated, successful film by all standards, and then you make more films, and then in 1984 you tell your dad, you finish a book called The Killer Angels, and you do a series, and we see two scenes, 2 clips from that series just now. One is, of course, Frederick Douglass, and then the Sullivan-Ballou letter. And they're both on the same side of this conflict, theoretically, but what different takes on America and what they're fighting for, and how does that contribute to the story?
Well, it's so interesting. They are 2 of the most important quotes I've ever put in any film. Frederick Douglass is well known. Sullivan-Ballou is not, or was not. Today I'll tell you that today, in 100 places in America, that letter is read at a wedding, or a renewal of vows, or something like that. I discovered it from one of our advisors. With the exception of Barbara Fields, who's in the film, very few of our historical advisors, we had about 24, were sending us in first-person documentary material quotes. And I said, "Please." And this just came over the transom, and I read it. And so I remember reading it out loud and barely getting through the letter. And my brother said, "Well, we'll put it in the Battle of Manassas." I said, "No, we'll put it at the end of the episode. This is the whole stakes of the whole war. We'll finish the Battle of Manassas. It's a Union disaster. It's not going to be a 90-day war, but let's get through all the explanation and use it as the coda to say, you really want to know what it's about? It's this." And just think about what that letter is. It's about love, obviously, but what is it a love of? It's a love of government. Excuse me? People love their government. and they love their cause, and they love the organization of it, and they love their family, and they love their children, and they love their wife, and they love the wife as a lover as well as a mother of their children, and it's eternal. Like every man wishes he could say these words to his woman, and every woman certainly wishes her man could say the words to him. And so it has this thing. I used to carry a copy of that in my wallet until it disintegrated, because everywhere I went for the first 15 years after the Civil War came out, somebody would say, "Do you have that? Can you read that?" You know, and I would read it. And it was just that. And the other thing that we have to remember is that there's a huge conspiracy. One of the reasons why my daughter Sarah, who was here this morning, and my son-in-law David McMahon, we've been working on a film for many years on Reconstruction called Emancipation Day, Exodus. It was, you know, our history comes down that tells us that the heroes of Reconstruction are our own homegrown terrorist organization, kind of like ISIS or Al-Qaeda, called the Ku Klux Klan, and that it was bad Yankees going down, carpetbaggers, and it was infantile Negroes who could not handle freedom and therefore mess. And this is a lie. It's the exact opposite. The Reconstruction is a good period which represents some progress in civil rights, and its collapse, its murder, is the tragedy. And so trying to tell a complicated story about that is important. Same is true of the Civil War. What the agreement was when Reconstruction finished is that we're a white nation, sorry about that. And that what's more important a narrative is that we fought, we were opposed to each other, now we've come back together. There isn't one mention of the word slavery anywhere in that battlefield. Anywhere. And that's why that battle, the greatest battle in North America, took place over that. And so you wanted to, at the beginning, say that there is not a mention in the South Carolina Articles of Secession. South Carolina was the first state to secede from the Union right after Lincoln's election in November of 1860. It does not mention nullification, interposition, or, you know, any of the other states' rights. It mentions slavery over and over again. And so after our prologue and our introduction, we wanted to remind us of what it is in a country that was born 45 years before on the idea that all men are created equal, something we are bragging to the world. In fact, out of the 9 million people in the South, 4 million of them were owned by other people. And that we ought to hear from somebody who had had the experience of it, had stolen himself, as the phrase went, which is a wonderful thing, stolen himself from slavery, and was so articulate that no one believed that he could possibly have been enslaved, and so he wrote a book of this thing. And it is important to begin with the idea of this hugely important yes but in the extraordinary, and I will say exceptional, story of the United States, to be able to, if we are that exceptional, if you are the Tom Brady of countries, you are looking for every minute flaw that you might have and trying to improve it. So why the hell, if we are so exceptional, do we not focus entirely on those things that need improvement and improve them? And storytelling is one way you do that.
Yeah. I'm sure many people remember when that series comes out, and maybe in particular, I mean, those are both the same episode. That's the first episode of the Civil War, which of course is essentially a revolutionary series in history in your life, I know, and talking to your daughter in her life. But in this town, I mean, many of us were here. I was a little kid, but I remember that. And that, even though that Sullivan-Ballou letter and that Frederick Douglass are so opposite, in some ways, the Sullivan-Ballou letter is the hook that people, you obviously end the episode very intentionally because everyone wants.
And Sullivan-Ballou is there because of Frederick Douglass.
Right.
He's there for two things: union, but he's there because he believes in abolition. That you cannot have, as Lincoln said, you can't be permanently half slave and half free. A house divided against itself cannot stand. This is important. This is really important. So the interrelationship of all of this stuff is clear.
The complexity, I mean, and that's what you always say, is it's
well, you know what we have in the editing room? We have a neon sign that says in lowercase cursive, it's complicated. Because it's sort of like your statement about, lots to work out, right? There's not a filmmaker on earth that if the scene is working, you don't want to touch it. You just want to leave it alone. And we have been doing nothing for the last 50 years but undoing good scenes and making them more complicated, probably most of them making them less perfect, but much more accurate. And then I think much more emotionally complex and therefore binding in a way. Music plays an important part, which we haven't talked about. Mm-hmm. And music is the only art form that's invisible, Wynton Marsalis points out, right? It's the art of the invisible. Every other art form, you have to see it, right? Music, it works on you so much faster, and it's my brother's contention that all other art forms, when they die and go to heaven, want to be music, right? And so a good deal of the art of storytelling is a completely, there's no way to articulate exactly how it works, but it works. And I am not trained in music, but I know when something works. And so we work forever. We often record our music well before we begin editing. And so we will edit to the music, not the other way around.
Well, and you've done that in different ways. We were just talking about that backstage, is that obviously you have like Sullivan Blue, the iconic Ashokan Farewell, and that's just needle drop from Jay Unger's, just a record or a tape or whatever you had back. But then looking at the war, I mean, that's Wynton is literally composing.
So Wynton composed a number of themes for each. We told the story. The film in the Second World War is the only time I've really made a film in which there have been literally hundreds of other brethren. And I wasn't looking for the sake of trying to be different, of a different way to do it, but I felt one way that was important was to see the greatest cataclysm in human history from the bottom up. So we picked 4 geographically distributed American towns: Waterbury, Connecticut, Mobile, Alabama, Sacramento, California, that had about 100,000 in 1941, and tiny Laverne, Minnesota, with 3,500, to tell the story of the war. And that was a new way. It was sort of a refreshing way to help you deal with it and understand it. But I asked Wynton, who did a theme for each of the 4 towns, and then he did other themes, and then in some of their sessions, they would just go off and do stuff. And one of his percussionists, the guy named guitarist, one of his guitarists, Doug Womble, started doing that stuff with that guitar string that was just, it was sort of like when somebody puts a bottle and does it, but he had a little laser light too. So it had a just eerie sound to it that was part of the spookiness and the otherness of being in combat.
I mean, when you're working on any of these films, any of these scenes, is there a method where you're starting with the music? You obviously have some historical research, you have some interviews you've looked at, you have imagery that you or Buddy or someone shot. Like, is there a method that you start with, or is each one a little different? Or
so each one's a little bit different because you calibrate. Some, there's no first-person voices in the Vietnam film, except a letter from a guy who doesn't survive, right? Because we've got the witnesses. There's no first-person accounts in the American Revolution. So already we have lots of stuff. We have no photographs or newsreels, so lots of different, as I've discussed, stuff gets changed. But what it is the left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing. We're working on a script, unconcerned with whether there are images to fill that script. We're just trying to tell a story and get it right. Same time we're out filming, as I'm saying, just collecting a bunch of stuff. We're talking to scholars, but we're not saying, can you get me from paragraph 2 to paragraph 3 on page 6 of episode 4, because it doesn't exist yet. We're asking broad questions about it, and we're collecting way more than we need. And all of this makes for a great deal of horse trading. And as I said, we haven't directed the reenactors to fire because this is the Battle of Long Island. It's just, I'll say, do we have any more muskets firing live that we can go into that painting where you can see the muskets going off? And so we work on it, and they're sort of hand stitched together, and each one has a different. It's constant calibration and recalibration of things depending on all of the stuff that we have going. And then, of course, everything, including the World War II footage, comes to us silent. Yeah. So I am now in the process, and we've got 2 more to go, mixing episodes for the American Revolution. We have hundreds of soundtracks. That's hundreds of soundtracks. And so when you listen to it, you will think that's the sound you got when those soldiers were marching through that early growth cornfield. It's every single thing we've put together, every footfall, every brush of a trouser leg against a corn frond. It's like, that's how it is to make it come alive. All of these are elements of storytelling which should be invisible at the end. You shouldn't notice it. You should hear the voice, hear the third person, hear the first person, hear the music, and maybe the gunfire, the loudest of the stuff, if it's a war film, has some sort of dynamics to it that scares you or moves you or gives you the sense of being present.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and it's all in the purpose of serving the story. I mean,
That's right.
I mean, is a tension between the editors, the writers. I mean, the cinematographers aren't really in the edit usually. I'm not saying, but like,
No.
and you're there obviously as a director and producer. Like, how does that work out? Like when you have all these elements, and I mean, I'm sure the writer likes the words, the editor wants the edit. You know.
Yes, so it kind of filters. We've been working together. Nobody yells, if that's a question, which is nice. There's sometimes tension. There's urgency. There's advocacy. Somebody really thinks, and I'll be going like this because I'm concentrating, and then I go, wait, what were you saying? And they go, that's fantastic. Let's do that. Or so there's lots of that. It filters through me. I mean, the writing comes to me, and then I change it a lot so it can be read out loud, not just heard. I'm the scratch narrator. And then editors who I've worked with for years, the senior editor on the American Revolution, who's retiring once this is done in June, has worked with me since she was an 18-year-old unpaid intern for the third film on the Statue of Liberty in the early 1980s. And that, wow. You know, I don't even have to talk to her anymore. We just look at each other, and she knows if I don't like it, and I know if she doesn't like it, and I'll go, what? She said, what about this? And you go, great, you know? And I love this yellow door we had, which was Washington's headquarters in Cambridge, and we use it later on in the film. It was in the introduction. Beautiful yellow house, which is now, I guess, the Cambridge Historical Society, but it was a loyalist, somebody, minister's house, and Washington occupied it in Cambridge for the time they were laying siege to Boston. And we had a wonderful thing, which I thought we were going to see. And she said, I just don't like the dissolve from the yellow door out to this aerial drone shot that we have. And I said, I think it's fine. And then she said, can I try something? And she put in this house with green shutters, it kind of surrounded. And the line is essentially, it was fought in hundreds of places, blah, 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 in cities and towns. And you're hearing gunfire against this house. And this is a very well-to-do yellow house. This is more a generic, and I went, oh my God, it's perfect. You know, I still get the yellow house later on in episode 2 when Washington's there, but you know, it usually is the case that every single shot in our introduction is somewhere in the film. We always want that to be.
Yeah, well, I mean, it works
sort of like
almost
the table of contents, wherein
foreshadowing
Huck and Tom, you know, yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, you see that a lot where in these shots, and I mean, you do that musically too.
Well, in the Vietnam opening is the most dramatic, probably because it's kind of got 3 little movements to it in the 10 or 11 minutes, and the middle one is running everything backwards. And the first thing you see with this incredibly chaotic Trent Reznor, Atticus Ross music is the a helicopter coming up out of the South China Sea onto the deck of an aircraft carrier as we're throwing away the equipment that we've spent. And the next thing is a Soviet-made tank breaking down the walls of the Saigon Palace. At one point, we pull up the guy who's assassinated during Tet on the streets with a little girl covered in napalm is running backwards. And the last shot is a French soldier walking backwards through the stuff. And each one of that montage, which is just stunning to watch, sort of undoing it, resetting to 0, is a way of saying, okay, now forget everything. Let's start at the beginning, and then you can move. And that's an important device of introduction. It's just like you go into a musical theater and you hear that overture at the beginning, and it's My Fair Lady, and you hear 6 or 7 songs, and you don't yet know that I'm hearing On the Street Where You Live, I'm Getting Married in the Morning, you know, all the various songs, but you hear that stuff, and then gradually all of them pay off within it. All of that is elements of storytelling. It is about how, at the very basic, you are asking for and somehow deserving of the attention of another. That's what the whole bargain is. And it is a bargain. It's a huge responsibility. And so we spend a lot of time, because I sit there over and over again trying to be the person who has never seen this before, even though I've seen it 100 times, how to unsee everything so that I can receive and go, wait a second, that lasted just a little bit too long. That lasted a little bit too short. That's not the right image, Tricia says. She's right. What if we change that Thomas Paine thing with the cannon and move it to the very front of the film? This talking head is really great, and we love him, but we're too in love with him, and it's a little bit too complicated this early. Let's pull it out. So instead of 4 talking heads in a row, we have 3, and that's perfect, right? And so this is minute, it's like it's polishing a stone over and over and over again.
Yeah.
And that's why only PBS, the only place I could have made any of the films, is because nobody else is going to give me that time. I could walk into a streaming service or a premium cable tomorrow and say, hey, I need $30 million to do the Vietnam film. They'd give it to me just based on my track record, but they wouldn't give me 10 and a half years. They'd say, oh, we need it in 18 months. And my Vietnam after 18 months would look like, what? It wouldn't be good.
Yeah, I mean, and the amount of time and effort you put into it, and to find that story, and to admit late in the game that, oh, this scene has to go at the beginning or the end, and change that, and there's not a bunch of executives or people that are working there that weren't there when you started or something telling you what to do. This is your film, and you and your team are doing.
What we bring in scholars from the very beginning. A lot of the granting that we have from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the National Endowment for the Humanities, hopefully they're not resting in peace. They require having consultants, academic advisors, and a lot of my colleagues begrudge it, and we don't. We bring them in when we're writing treatments, the first draft of the script. We'll bring them in. They get told they're interested in our world, we're interested in theirs, and some of the scholars would come 3 or 4 times to different screenings. And at one point, I remember a little bit over a year ago, somebody said, you do lots of loyalist voices, and it's really great. You're just ecumenical, there's no judgment, you could understand. A loyalist would be essentially what we'd call a conservative today. The greatest form of government on earth at that point, without a doubt, is the British constitutional monarchy. Our prosperity is due to that. Why the hell would I want to change it for your insane radical ideas that all men are created equal? That's crazy, right? That's a loyalist. There's nothing wrong with that. And there's lots of people in the state of Pennsylvania who are loyalists, right? And a lot of the Quakers in Philadelphia were loyalists. And that was okay. And so we made them characters. And then one scholar said, you don't have anybody who's a through line. Like you follow John Greenwood, this 14-year-old fifer, and you follow Joseph Plum Morton, this 15-year-old from Connecticut, and you follow Betsy Ambler, this 10-year-old to a 16-year-old from Yorktown, as kids, and you follow lots of other patriots, different people. Why aren't you have lots of different loyalist voices, but you're not following anybody? And they suggested somebody. But and we explored it, and it was an interesting story. But I also remember there was a loyalist quote from our 4th episode on the Battle of Bennington outside of Bennington in what's New York State would be Vermont, is where Bennington is, and it's a Patriot victory. But there is a guy that had a quote named John Peters, and he is, in this quote, describes how he is manning this redoubt and he's being charged by this patriot, and he said old friends were fighting one another, and he hears somebody say, Peters, you damn Tory, which is another derogatory name for a loyalist. And it is his childhood friend from Jeremiah Post. They'd been best friends growing up, and he was even the cousin of a relatives of his. And as Peter says, as Post's bayonet went into my breast, deflected by his bone, he was obliged to destroy him. I said, this is the most spectacular quote about the Civil War that our American Revolution is. What do we know about him? Well, it turns out he was the most respected person in his Vermont neighborhood. They sent him to the Continental Congress. He gets there and he goes, I'm not about this. He's arrested in Wethersfield, Connecticut on the way back, in Hartford, in Springfield, Massachusetts. And when he gets home, his father even tells the group of patriots to give him a severe bruising. He's finally driven from his house. He goes to Canada. Finally, his wife, an infant child, and 2 other toddlers are driven from their house in the winter by patriots. She makes it somehow alive to Lake Champlain, where a British patrol boat picks her up, reunites the family. He forms a loyalist regiment and comes down. The first person to sign up is his 15-year-old son. They come down. They end up in Burgoyne's army as part of the defeat at the Battle of Bennington. And he lives through the thing. He finally escapes and gets back to Canada and chooses to live in Nova Scotia. So we follow him through almost all of the episodes. And rather than it being just the spectacular quote, destroying your best friend, obliged to destroy his best friend growing up, you can begin to understand in one thing, and then in the through line of his story, the complexity and the intertwining of the stories we're trying to tell.
Is that, so you sort of find the climax or the highlight of the story, like this quote, and then you build out around it with the
No,
research?
it's there. We've got it. It's one of those things you go, that's a fantastic quote. And then when you're thinking about how do we expand a loyalist presence or have it stretch across, one character stretch across at least a few episodes, you explore. And the person that the scholars had suggested was a fairly well-known loyalist story, not bad, but Peter's was unknown. And it was really good to, or less well known, and really good to sort of explore it and do it. And so that's the work that goes on. Imagine building a highway an interstate highway out of nothing. First thing you do is you bring in bulldozers and you cut down the trees and you smooth the thing out, and you've got something that maybe you can go 5 miles an hour on. At some point, you're going to get to 75 miles an hour. But it's a long time. And so we're just grading and regrading and grading. And the thing is not knowing at the beginning what it is. And you're sometimes, the writer is going, yikes, you're taking out a lot. And it's sometimes better. Or you get to a place and 6 months later you go, we always save. The next draft has a ghost version of the last draft. That is to say, anything I take out is now in italics the next time around. Oh, and you might go 6 more months, you might be 6 more drafts, and you go, wait a second, what is it? What did we take back out in January? And you go back, and now the scene has the confidence or the strength to be able to take that information that it couldn't hold, and you can put it back in, right? Yeah. Or you're doing something conversely, like something that works perfectly, but you're taking it out.
And sometimes it's coming from people that are historic and well-known and either top-down generals and presidents and so forth, and sometimes it's unknown or lesser-known people. But you certainly, not say the only one, but using people that we've never heard of that then become iconic characters of our history, and Sullivan Ballou is probably a good example. And those 2 clips we see around World War II, one is from the U.S. in the Holocaust, the second is, of course, Inouye in the last, I think it's the last episode of the war. They're both well-known people.
Yeah.
Anne Frank is, of course, world famous years before you were working. Ironically, she's younger than Inouye, that he's speaking to us alive.
Well, here's our series on the Holocaust, which was a 3-part film. That was clips from the 3rd episode, and her optimism about the human race. She doesn't intersect with the Holocaust yet. Yeah. That last line you heard, where Dutch policemen and Nazis, they were betrayed, and then she meets the Holocaust, and we'll sort of, as someone says, I'm not so sure she'd feel the same way about humanity after what happens to her and her sister and her mother and father. The whole series opens with her father, who's a well-to-do German, who is reading the handwriting on the wall and has left Germany and has moved to Amsterdam and is applying to the United States. He's within the quotas. He fits every bill because he's well-to-do. He's not going to be a ward of the state, dependent of the state. That's the excuse that people are using. And he can't get into the United States. So Daniel Inouye just died within the last few years. Anne Frank could have come to the United States. She could be alive. She could be a writer or not a writer. She's given a journal for her birthday, and she starts writing in it. And we know the feelings of a little girl who's in hiding, and both the naive and the incredibly prescient stuff. But she knows nothing about what's about to happen to her or what's the story. And, you know, you kind of want, I sort of go back and forth. I want her to have come to the United States. It is a shame on us that she didn't come, and that I want her to be alive, or maybe just like Daniel Inouye just passed away. But I don't know. I go back, yes, want her to be a writer. What would she be writing about? Or maybe no. What if she just lived a life and was a grandmother and maybe a great-grandmother, and you know, could look back on how lucky it was that her father had gotten her out of Berlin and got them to Amsterdam and then got them to the United States. But didn't happen that way. And so she's Anne Frank, you know?
Yeah, which is, you know, and she's
But it's a
immortal
different
now.
Anne Frank if you take that off. And that's, I think, what you've suggested in your question is we have tried to say, and I think you'll feel this getting to know our Washington, that we think we know these people. Like Anne Frank is usually the first intersection Americans have as children with the Holocaust. And one of the reasons she's the entry point is because her writing stopped before she hits the Holocaust. Then we can say, sorry, there's bad news, right? But we wanted to say there's a different Anne Frank here. There's a more complicated Anne Frank, that this is a family struggling now, having been refused into the United States. Not refused, but they just, we sat on it. We saved more people than any other sovereign nation. We have to say sovereign because Palestine took in a lot of people. But we took in more than any other nation. But it was a quarter of what even our parsimonious quotas would have permitted. And if we'd just been more humane and generous, we could have doubled it, which means we could have saved 2 million people. If you subtract 2 million from 6 million, that is a hell of a lot. And I'd love to be in a country that did that rather than the country that we, you know, have to talk about. But, you know, it's a complicated story. It's complicated.
It's complicated. Yeah, yeah. I mean, and we're in complicated times now. I mean, for sure, there's no doubt. Maybe they're always complicated. But
They're always complicated. Sometimes are more complicated than others. It's like Animal Farm. All animals are equal. And then later, some animals are more equal than others.
And so, I mean, really, no matter how you're feeling about what we're going through at this moment, like where does storytelling, why is your work and why is storytelling so vital to?
Well, I think Richard Powers gets it, is that if you live in a binary, you're wrong, I'm right, nothing happens. You don't have any relationships, that's it. If you permit a nuance and complicated dynamic to obtain, then stories become the way in which we are actually changed and transformed. And if you live just in a binary thing, you're just a transactional, everything is transactional. And there's nothing valuable about life in a transactional world. And so what the gift of storytelling is the ability to explode. I mean, I've described it earlier as a kind of Trojan horse. Not that is brought in, it's a gift, but it doesn't betray. It gets out in the middle of the night and it flows through. And you know, as he says, the best arguments in the world won't change a single person's point of view. The only thing that can do that is a good story. And it doesn't matter what your point of view is, how you want people to change, because it rarely happens that way. You provide a lot of information, and something happens in the act of storytelling in which, after a Civil War series, a lot of people just picked up and came to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. I was walking across the lawn of the old, visitor center with the superintendent a year afterwards, and we're walking across the green lawn, you know, and he reaches down and he picks up a popsicle wrapper and he waves it in my face and he goes, "It's all your fault." And that's what a good story is.
And so now, I mean, now you've done, I mean, you're finishing up the revolution. We talked about emancipation, Exodus with Sarah and Dave a little bit. I mean, you're going to keep doing this. I mean, you're approaching 50 years of producing films, right?
Well, more than 50 years, but I started the work on Brooklyn Bridge, which was the first film broadcast on PBS in '77. So I've got a couple years before it's 50 years from when I started that film. But yeah, we're working on it. These are not just ideas; they're not stuff in development, but we're actually working on 4 or 5 films that will extend through 2030. God and funding willing.